On our panel today, we have Dominic Brown and Mazibuko Jaha, who I asked them, how would you like me to describe you? And Mazibuko said, a Marxist, and Dominic said, a radical Marxist. So that's what we have here. They're both involved in a range of organizations, including AIDC, where Dominic is full-time and Mazibuko is involved there. They publish Amandla, which many of you have, and it's also available outside to your left. So, as I said, I'm going to give a very brief overview. I was asked to do sort of a brief contextualization of why we're having this conversation. Franz Fanon, whose Pitfalls of National Consciousness is a masterful application of a Marxian theory in conjunction with a psychoanalytic method, put it well. A Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. We had a workshop in this room previously, in the previous session on Fanon, and I think that really emphasized how important it is to do this. A vast host of people in the formerly colonial world had already taken up Fanon's call. Before the wretched of the earth, Marxist theories that engaged in a specific cultural, national, and social environments of the colonial world had already been developed. Anti-colonial movement looks towards Marxism-Leninism in particular as a solution to the problems of underdevelopment, exploitation, and oppression. This resulted in a vast body of work promoting diverse ideas and modes of political praxis. Writing about the US in the 60s and 70s, Max Albohm has argued that what was termed Third World Marxism had a profound influence on a new generation of left activists in the US, who sought to understand particularly questions around imperialism and anti-racism, something which the traditional communist parties had not been able to help them with. This rich political and intellectual tradition deserves recognition, particularly as the legacies of colonialism and imperialism are under the microscope in present-day crises of neoliberal capitalism. In the 20th century, Marxism was a dominant force on the left, and for those working towards improving society more broadly. Marxism was also a dominant force in many universities and activist and political spaces in South Africa, especially in the anti-apartheid movements. As a result, South Africa has a rich tradition within Marxism. You guys can see we've handed out this, which is a seminal debate in South Africa, a response to Joe Slobo's pamphlet on how socialism failed. And we know that a number of political parties, trade union federations, and members of civil society continue to draw on inspiration from Marx's work. The central question that has animated these debates has largely been the national question in South Africa. So how do we conceive of the relationship between anti-racist, feminist, anti-colonial, and class struggle? A question that remains at the heart of our contemporary discourse, I think. While Marxism still has a home in political parties, it has all but left academia. Part of the reason for Marx's flight from the academy is undoubtedly the dominance of intellectual neoliberalism since the 1970s, but the left has also played a part in Marxism's retreat. Indeed, I think that it's not so much that radicals have left academia, but that radical socialist intellectuals have often been replaced by postmodern and culturalist intellectuals, many of whom have been ones who've given the most strident critiques. We know that there is a vast movement underway to try to decolonize in the wake of Corbyn and Sanders campaigns in the US. We have democratic socialist candidates winning a number of important victories. We've got left-wing governments coming into power in a number of other countries. In short, to me, there are a number of young people coming to Marx and to socialism devoid of associations with Soviet-style communism. In this sense, there's a need to look back at Marx and Marxism outside of the Stalinist tradition. And I think this is very important within the academy, but I think we also need to think beyond that. So we're talking about economics. Marxism has not been a dominant force in economics departments by any stretch of the imagination, although there are a number of people part of the Rethinking movement who are Marxists or influenced by Marx who are trying to bring that in there. And I think that's really important. But I think we also need to talk about how this can apply outside of the university, right? And if we're rethinking economics, it's not just about the university. So I hope that the panelists will be discussing how Marxism is relevant in broader social struggles. And without further ado, I will pass over to Dominic.
I can speak to about 5 points. One, I'd like to contextualize the crisis in capitalism today. And then I want to pose the question about why speak about Marxism in Africa? The third point I'll speak to is looking at Marx as a critique of an idealistic conception of history and his development of historical materialism as a method to understanding human history. And then talk a little bit how this was applied in Africa before making some concluding remarks. So I think 200 years since Marx is dead, and 150 years after he wrote Das Kapital, capitalism is in deep crisis. We are seeing the re-intensification of inter-imperialist rivalries in the context of waning US hegemony and the unraveling of the neoliberal paradigm. In this context, we are seeing a transfer of the costs of the crisis onto working class people, and these includes the employed and the unemployed, the young and the old, the urban and the rural. We are seeing the perpetuation of extractivism and the destruction of our natural environment, and the entrenchment of gendered oppression and the violence against women. While these issues may seem removed from the global political economy, they are intrinsically entrenched. As these crises deepen, people find it more difficult to accept modes of thought which rationalize the system that is unraveling. Moreover, we need to be critical of the role of education and the education system, as well as dominant ideologies in society, which in effect is used to perpetuate the class structure of society. This is essentially a critique of the location of this conversation and the need to move beyond the academia, especially in terms of where and how we are having this discussion. It is in this context that we desperately need to find an anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, and eco-socialist alternatives, particularly when capitalism uses ideology, including bourgeois economics, to distort our perception of how the world works. It is here that we should ask the question, is Marx and Marxism still relevant as an emancipatory framework of analysis that can potentially help us to understand the changes in the global, African, and the South African economy? Not to understand as an end in itself, but towards shifting the balance of power towards marginalized people in society, in fostering and bringing into being alternatives. It is in this context which I'll attempt to speak to the question of Marxism in Africa. So why pose this question to begin with? I think the question arises in the context where there's an argument that Marxism is Eurocentric and irrelevant for Africans. In response to this, I think that it is useful to begin by asking ourselves whether changes in time and place make a difference to whether Marxism is relevant or not. Now, if we assume that Marxism is relevant to Western Europe due to the fact that it is where the Marxist method was developed, to what extent does its relevance extend across time and place? Or to ask the question more directly, is a Marxist method valid for black people, women, gender non-conforming folk in Africa? To be able to answer this question, I think it's important to turn to Marxist methodology. Now, I'm sure many of us, if not most of us, have heard the saying, or rather, if not all of us, have heard the saying, socialism is a good idea, but will never happen because you can't change human nature. Marx set out to develop a scientific approach to understanding the history of human beings and, in effect, what is a human nature. For Marx, the way people are cannot be separated from the society in which they live. So to understand how people behave, they must first analyze the historically changing totality of social relations. Thus, in a sense, Marx rejects the idea of an unchanging human nature. Nonetheless, he argued that human beings in very different societies share some things in common. For him, it is precisely these things or these common characteristics that can help us to understand why societies change, including the core beliefs, wants, and capacities of the people who make up these societies. And for Marx, labor or production is the essence of human beings and the basis of society. What does this mean? Human beings are part of nature, and like the rest of nature, we are motivated by the need to survive and reproduce ourselves. But we are different from other animals in that there are many different ways in which people can meet their needs. This is because human beings are conscious and self-aware and have been able to change the way in which we produce over time. And this is because of our ability to reflect on what we have done and think about how we can do it better. Consequently, Marx considered productive labor to be fundamental to what human beings are, but the labor of human beings is not independent from the objective reality or the natural environment in which we find ourselves. This is a dynamic interchange between what influences people and how people through their labor transforms the natural environment in this robust way. This process does not end here. In this process of transforming nature, human beings also transform themselves. This means that if we agree that production is the essence of humanity, then it follows that in trying to make sense of society, we have to pay attention to the way in which production is organized. The implications of this is that if production is a social activity, then it means that the changes in the way production is organized will result in changes in society. Marx has concentrated on the social relations of production, forming the underlying basis of his method, particularly during the period of the anti-colonial movement. Amilcar Cabral is a concrete example of this. In his attempts to record the history of the people of Guinea-Bissau, Cabral began by looking at the people in the process of production and the modes of production over time in his country, and through this he showed the relevance of applying the Marxist method to African society by discerning how Guinea-Bissau society evolved over time. This is useful in response to those who posit that Marxism is a Eurocentric phenomenon and that consequently it's alien to black people. What proponents of this argument do not account for is the fact that Marxist methodology has been taken further and indigenized in many parts of the world outside of Europe, including Asia, South America, and not least in Africa. Besides Cabral, the same framework was adopted and adapted by Samora Michel, Thomas Sankara, Frantz Fanon, and many others in the determination to underline and underscore the need to construct and reconstruct alternative societies. Thus, Marxism cannot be Eurocentric. It's universal, manifesting itself in different Marxisms, depending on when and where the methodology is applied. There are also some who are happy to agree with this, but are still inclined to ask, is there not a third way that is neither capitalist nor socialist, but that is anti-capitalist? In an attempt to more effectively address the interest of Africans towards the liberation of African people, and this gave rise to Pan-African conceptions and African socialism. Ultimately, these perspectives fail because the idea of developing a thought different from elite ideologies and different from socialist thought through their eclecticism has resulted in them developing yet another elite or bourgeois perspective. Walter Rodney argued quite strongly against some proponents of African socialism, arguing that they were disingenuous and tricksters who want to dupe the majority of the population and who ultimately had no intention to advance revolutionary practice. There are others who are honest in trying to forge a radical perspective and practice for the majority of African people. Kwame Nkrumah is an example of this. Not wanting to adopt what he felt as something that is alien to Africa in his search for an African ideological framework for emancipation. He did not totally reject the socialist perspective, but rather attempted to combine the socialist perspective with contradictory ideological ideas, rather than taking the socialist premises to its logical conclusion. And that is the imperative of dismantling private property within society through class struggle. After Nkrumah was usurped, overthrown from power by the middle class or the national bourgeoisie, in Fanon terms, in Ghana, he penned his reflection in a piece called Class Struggle in Africa, in which he essentially admits the misleading consequences of an ideology that embraces a narrow African perspective. Therefore, I would argue that the marginalized people of Africa should have a collective and self-interest in scientific socialism as a theoretical instrument that can be a means to critique and dismantle the capitalist, patriarchal, imperialist structure of society. A scientific socialist approach is relevant and critical because it is deliberately aimed at undermining the current system of production and the social and political relations that stem from it. But is scientific socialism enough? So in conclusion, I would like to suggest that Marxism is a good basis for an emancipatory thought. Whilst at the same time, I think we can uphold emancipatory and revolutionary perspectives without claiming to have all the answers. The world has changed since these old perspectives were formulated. The collective task of developing new perspectives still lie ahead. And it is in this spirit that I would like to offer some thoughts on the process of forming perspectives of a renewed Marxism in Africa and in the world, which can inform the struggles that lie ahead. And there's 4 imaginations that I would like to conclude with. 1, I think we need to rethink the agents of change in understanding multiple forms of oppression and exploitation today. This means that we need to move beyond a narrow worker perspective and recognize the critical role youth, women, and environmentally precarious can play in the dismantling of the current hierarchical and oppressive structures of society. Secondly, I think we should avoid sectarianism at all costs. We should welcome pluralism. We should welcome a pluralism of views and perspectives within a framework of emancipatory anti-capitalist politics, as long as these perspectives do not mitigate against the liberation of oppressed classes, allow hundreds of flowers to bloom and 1,000 schools of thought to flourish. Third, I think we need to think about sites of struggle beyond the nation state, looking to local and regional sites of struggle as a means to decentralize and democratize power. Finally, whilst we resist oppression and exploitation, it is important to simultaneously attempt to construct alternatives now, new ways of organizing production and the social relations that drive production. And in so doing, building the future in the present. Here, theory must inform practice, and practice must inform our theory that we need to espouse today. Thank you.
Good morning, comrades. If I didn't speak to Dominic last night, I would have said 90% of what he said. So I scribbled new notes. It's a pity that Musa is not here because she is one of the very few grounded African queer women Marxists. So perhaps it's a strong critique actually that Marxism still remains a male domain in this continent and elsewhere. So it's part of the blind spots I think has to work on. Dominic started with a reference to the need for a universalist approach away from a narrow essentialist Africanist approach. I'm saying Africanist deliberately. Not because I'm doing a critique of Pan-Africanism, but some of the noise that came through from the Fordist movement and moment did actually essentialize an African identity in very problematic ways. What is striking for me is that those who were making a critique among the Fordists and perhaps black radical nationalists in the Pan-Africanist Congress and black consciousness movement then do not consistently take that essentialist critique to Christianity, for example. Many of them, for example, Christianity. who would be Christians. But the other aspect of this is, in fact, in terms of their own class position, also class aspiration, there's also quite a contradiction there, because it's not necessarily a critique that says there is actually a revolutionary perspective that can then challenge class power and class inequality. And in fact, many of the critiques, while pretending to be revolutionary, actually take on board many of the pitfalls of postmodernism. I don't have time to explain what I mean by that regard. We can come back to it in discussion. And postmodernism is basically becoming a perspective that actually ignores structural systemic questions and as actually the cultural identity of late capitalism. So I think it's important to assert the relevance of Marxism as a pushback against the critiques that have emerged. Not to say the critics not have a point, I'll come back to those. Moving on. Marxism has had moments in the continent. There are hidden histories, for example. We hear of actually very significant socialists and Marxists having been part of the struggle for liberation, and even many of the first post-colonial governments. For example, no one knows today that there was actually some serious Marxist cells within the first government, post-colonial government of Uganda. And we assume that the post-colonial state just assumed one path of development. So again, this is very useful to resurface, because like IFA has done with redistributing old debates from South Africa, it would be useful to dig these left experiments from elsewhere in the continent, because they held the potential and they also show what was defeated. In addition to these hidden histories, there was a variance of socialists in Africa of the kind that Dominic referred to. But what is interesting for me are the self-declared Marxist Leninist parties, particularly in Southern Africa, your LIMO, your MPLR, even ZANU at some point, and elsewhere in the continent. What is sufficient to say in that regard is the extent to which that self-declaration of Marxism-Leninism was actually a declaration from above, and a declaration of something that was quite Sovietized, quite Stalinized. The same thing that the ANC has actually done, and the Communist Party in South Africa has actually done as well. And the limits of that self-declaration from above showed up at the first moments of crisis, because the potentially powerful tools of analysis that Marxism puts forward could not be applied at moments of crisis. Because if Marxism is to be relevant, it has to be a set of tools that enable revolutionaries, that enable societies to actually grapple with problems and find ways to solve those problems. So that has been the core problem of Marxism in Africa after its initial, the kind of initial resistance that Dominic was talking about. And as it happens, this self-declared Marxist-Leninists also imposed such oppressive, such undemocratic, and such undynamic systems politically and economically, and thereby discrediting Marxism as a point of reference, or even the socialist project as a pinnacle of hope for their societies. Moving on from that, the key things that I think is useful to take when we grappling with Marxism is to recognize that in the majority of its experience, it has been used as a doctrine, as a doctrine to propagate, and actually less so as a tool of analysis. And that actually has undermined its potential. As a tool of analysis, it basically has concerned itself with a number of problems. The emergence of capitalism, its growth, its movement, its changes, and at the heart of that are questions about how does exploitation take place, how does alienation take place, how does the accumulation of capital take place. Those are the dominant features and themes that Marxism has put forward as a tool of analysis. In other words, the internal logic of the system or of exploitation. Less remembered are other its major contributions from, if you take Marx and Engels as the originators of the ideology, For example, Engels's treatment about the origin of family and private property, in my view, is one of the most thoroughgoing analysis of the emergence of gender oppression in society. That was forgotten a long time ago. Also forgotten was Marx's reference to the ecological question. It hits us today when capitalism has clearly demonstrated how it has reached biophysical limits to its continued growth and expansion. And yet, in Marxist theory, there was a body of thought that Marx had introduced around ecology. But it would be a mistake to just confine Marxism to Marx and Engels as its founders. There have been many other innovations beyond those two. Dominic has referred to a number of African Marxists and Marxists elsewhere. But experiences and engagements that Marxism has had with society from other societies have raised other questions. For example, in my view, there is no better treatment to this day anywhere in the world of the agrarian question other than from a Marxist perspective. Whether the Marxists themselves differ. For example, the Northern Marxists regard the agrarian question as a question, an agrarian question of labor. In other words, what historically was resolved by the transition to capitalism and agriculture was the agrarian question of capital. And then they are saying today, the agrarian question of labor. These masses of people who are unemployed, who seem to be peasants, perhaps not peasants, it's their turn. Whereas those in the South are saying the agrarian question, the Marxists in the South are saying the agrarian question of today has to be linked to incomplete questions of national liberation, of the position of the South in the global economy. So that's very important. You actually realize that Marxism as a body of thought cannot be confined to one set of writings and it ends there. This is where then the quote from Rosa Luxemburg becomes very important. She says, Marxism must abhor nothing so much as the possibility that it becomes congealed in its current form. Marxism must abhor nothing so much as the possibility that it becomes congealed in its current form. It is at its best when butting its heads in self-criticism and in its historical thunder, enlightening it retains its strength. And I think that's very powerful because, like any body of thought, it cannot just be confined to what the founders or the seminal names had put forward back in the day. That's why then I think it's useful to consider experiments to indigenize Marxism in the African context. There were such experiments dealing with various themes. How do different modes of production articulate? That's one major question in the South African context. Harold Wolpe, Martin Legasik, and other Marxists in the 70s dealt with this question in a significant way. To put it simply, what was the relationship between the rural Transkei and the mining capitals in Johannesburg? Did those women who were apparently not working, just taking care of the house, did those women not play a role in actually subsidizing capitalist development and therefore profit accumulation in South Africa? So that was a major debate. And now that question becomes relevant today in my view, because actually it's still an underdeveloped pose in the world, whether it's in an urban context or rural context, or even peri-urban areas, or even between countries and between regions of the world. To what extent is the labor, the unrecognized labor of the exploited mass continue to subsidize capitalist accumulation elsewhere? To what extent are workers in Bangladesh subsidizing Nike with the forms of work that they are involved in? And I think that debate about this also raises something else. Given the crisis of capitalism globally, clearly capitalism is not meeting the needs of humanity. And now, can Marxism grapple with this somewhat semi-linked pole of existence? So in the case of Colombian, Comrade Dick says there are somewhat non-capitalist systems of production or making value in places such as those. If we defend the land against mining interests in Colombian, can that defense of the land go beyond to a new imaginary that maybe talks about popular welfare, maybe talks about the possibilities of delinking, even on a smaller scale. And this is where Samuel Amin becomes relevant, because it talks about delinking on a bigger scale, where countries grapple with this. Marxism has not moved far enough in this regard. I was just taking the one debate about how then Marxism can become indigenized with reference to modes of production. Other examples were about the understanding national oppression and therefore one strategy for national liberation, applying the Marxist analysis of imperialism to locate the role and position of the continent. And what is also important for us in thinking about the indigenization of Marxism is that South Africa, unlike most of the continent, had a very important moment of an organic working class Marxism. Today, when your foreigners and other Africanists critique Marxism, they forget this experience because the Marxists they see are Patrick Bond and other white names. I know it's in the room, I saw you. So they see those names in the academy and in the journals. But there's actually a very rich experience of indigenized, organic, working class Marxism, of diverse perspectives and standpoints in South Africa. This, I think, is what brings to the core, to the fore, the vitality of Marxism in South Africa compared to elsewhere in the continent. Because once those self-declared Marxist-Leninists could no longer sustain their project, they had no social base. Whereas in South Africa, even if neoliberals are dominant in the polity, but actually there's a residual resilience of organic working class Marxism beyond the academy and the journals. Of course, Marxism has a number of blind spots. The most striking thing in this regard is Lenin's declaration in State and Revolution, or Three Component Sources of Marxism, I can't remember which one it was, where he says, Marxism is omnipotent because it is true. That is quite a grand declaration that cuts out any debate, that cuts out any innovation of the kind of Alexander argues for example. So, for example, Marxism still struggles to understand oppressions, whether it's race, nation, sexual, gender, and other forms of oppression. Despite Marx's own initial contribution to the ecological question, but the actual experience of Marxism as a political system, as an economic system, failed to grapple with the ecological question in relation to economic development. But also, Marxism indeed developed as a theory, as a body of practice in Europe. So it should not be a surprise that it would have missed out the African social formation, or rather the African social formations, because those were not yet at the stage of capitalist development. They were following their own path of development. And therefore, that discussion of the modes of production was very important. But did it go far enough to understand the social formations as they exist? I think that's a question that remains open. The other blind spot, in my view, has reference to spirituality, particularly, again, that grand declaration about religion, religion being an opium of the people. Of course, I'm not religious myself, and I'm not religion with spirituality. But in all societies of the world, this question of spirituality matters. And is it necessarily the case that if you follow the dialectical materialist method, basically the key perspective there is that it is not social consciousness that determines the conditions. Rather, it's your conditions that determine social consciousness. But at the same time, spirituality is a very key factor, which I don't think is easy to understand and grapple with me from that standpoint. And in my view, I think there's a lot that people can do in this regard. For example, if you look at the Handa or the Handa in Zimbabwe, the struggle in Zimbabwe, the spirit medium being used as part of the struggle. But if you look at South America, how that plays a role in indigenous movements. So as part of inspiration, as part of building confidence. So for me, the big question in that regard. Then the one last blind spot I want to point to is the polemical versus the convivial. According to Dinga, because Europe was so cold, then they were forced to heat up the room by engaging in polemics. Whereas Africa is hot, we're more relaxed, we're more inclusive, we're more embracing. But that's true. Despite Tinga's reference as a joke, but I think it's a crucial question. And I think this is where the feminist practice comes in. Because how do you build a new nation and society if all you can do is undertake debate and struggle in only a polemical form? Isn't it all of us are products of oppression? So why would we have clarity on the issues? And what's the way to take us forward if we're not convivial? Lastly, on the problems of the present. So if Marxism is to remain relevant in an African context, there are a number of questions that it has to grapple with. I've already referred to the ecological question. Of course, let's come back now. The second one are the other aspects of capitalist crisis that are ongoing. How capitalism continues to accumulate profits for a few, how the future of work is not clear, how that affects life. What is the Marxist contribution to the resolution of those questions? Beyond a statement against capitalism, we need concrete answers in this regard. Neoliberalism rose for some 40-something years ago, went through crisis. The Marxist perspective was still not able to offer a political alternative or an economic alternative as a response to neoliberalism. Another key component that Marxism has to grapple with in a concrete way is the role of the market. Because, again, from that earlier experiment of Soviet socialism, there were very thwarted and warped understandings of the market. I don't think as Marxists we're very helpful to this question in a way that's quite present in our debates. The other one is how Marxism engages with other emancipatory ideas. Marxism cannot be omnipotent because it is true. It has gaps, it has blind spots. There are other forms of other socialisms, there are other forms of emancipatory ideas that it has to grapple with. Like the market, another thing that Marxism has to grapple with is the state. Those socialists who have grappled with the state are not your Marxist socialists. They are other kinds of socialists. And I think there's a blind spot here. For example, there's a very strong statist focus in Marxism. If you capture the state, you transform the state and so on. Whereas I think there's something more dialectical with a formulation along the lines with, beyond, and against the state. I don't know if I can explain that right now. I can come back to it. Dominic referred to another challenge for Marxism about agents of change. So in this regard, all I want to add is with reference to the unemployed mass, particularly if we want to rethink the meaning of work, if we want to give meaningful recognition to unpaid labor. So given that capitalism today is not able to provide work, what does Marxism put forward as a solution to resolve this question? But also, if work is to be reconceptualized, if unemployment is to be addressed, what then becomes the role of those who are outside your traditional working class? Thank you.
And Samoa Machel, I think their lives ended violently. So as we debate on Marxism, how do you place, I would say, capitalist violence on these Marxists that we have had, maybe not only in Africa, maybe world over? If I could extend another question, maybe now that we have this, let's say, EFF rising up on these issues of Marxism, where can Africa draw inspiration on the economies that Marxists are doing very well? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the very wonderful presentation. And my question is on how Marxism places the worker and the market at the center of its analysis. And if you realize most African economies are highly informalized, there are a lot of people who are working in the informal sector as vendors and as independent and as indigenous, entrepreneurs. And also at the same time, we have a large population which are peasants. So I don't know how Marxism, for those who are into Marxist, and Marxism as a way of organizing, how they can tap into those kind of informal sectors which are not part of the tools of analysis that Marxism relies on, such as the worker. And then my other point is that historically we've had scholars, we have used Marxism as a tool of analysis of critiquing capitalism. For example, the underdevelopment theorists during the 1970s and the 1980s in Latin America and so forth. How can African Marxist thinkers tap into that earlier generation of Marxist thinkers? Yeah. So I think that's my question for now.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to touch back on the point that you raised with the role of the state and thinking about it both beyond and against it. And maybe if you guys could touch on the current debates around the formation of a workers' party and whether or not that should be pursued.
Thanks. I am Oma from Command. Thank you very much for that presentation from the renowned publisher, Dominic. And certainly the gentleman there who gave played his mind on many sleepless nights. Look, I mean, I have questions for both of the presenters. My first question is around, I mean, what many sort of structural economists have seen as a distributional conflict between capital and labor, and how the organization of production in the 21st century, how Dominic sees that, because we've seen the globalization of so many value chains. I mean, you look at a simple thing like a phone and where it's designed and vis-a-vis where it's manufactured and where it's distributed and sold are no longer in the same place, which is what was happening when Marx and Engels were writing. And then, of course, the other issue is around, Dominic, the development of productive forces. I mean, Deng Xiaoping in China said, socialism is not about pauperism. Socialism is not about creating poor countries across the globe. But it's about saying, how do you develop the motive forces and the productive forces in the society so that you change material and cultural life of people. And I think in many instances, some of the statists and maybe some of the Marxism that's coming from above often forgets that task of saying, how do you develop the productive forces in order for you to also deal with issues like imperial backlash, where, if you do certain things, the likes of Trump will come for you in very meaningful ways. The other issue I wanted to find out, maybe as we go towards the fourth industrial revolution, surplus value, what then becomes the debate around the battle for that. And then, Conrad Mazibuko, I mean, I was quite interested in your dig at the Africanist and the Black consciousness movement as you started, because towards the end you also say there's a need for Marxism to engage with other emancipatory forms of emancipatory concepts or emancipatory projects. And one of the issues that I've always seen as the limitations of sort of the Marxist method, in a way, and I'd love to hear you out on this one, is the limitation, when we think about the national question, the limitation being around the dispossession of labor power versus the dispossession of existential being. So for instance, you have in many places across the globe, least of all on the continent and even in the diaspora, an emergence of capitalism intimately tied to slavery. Now, as a slave, you are not a slave because of what you do, but you're a slave because you are unfree. So it's a state of being rather than an issue of the kind of labor that you are doing. And in many ways, I think there's a limitation in the Marxist method in being able to embed that kind of third world conception of the subjectivity of a work, and how do you complement that with the subjectivity of a dispossessed being rather than a person who's dispossessed of their labor power. The last one I wanted to ask is just on this issue of delinking, some of your perspectives around the crisis within the imperial project and the emergence of China. What possibilities does that give us for the delinking? And then just lastly, I mean, on the indigenous Marxists. Just the last one. The penalty last point. That's the last one. No, I just wanted to add something. So on the indigenous Marxism, it's so interesting that on YouTube, because that's where also we are learning. There's a video where Henry Kwala, when he returned from Robben Island, where he talks for just over an hour on socialism, and the entire thing is in Isizu. And I found that very, very very, very interesting and very surprising for when he did it. So I would encourage everyone in the room to maybe interact with that.
So, first thing I want to say is that I'm glad I spoke before my book of this would have been a tough act to follow. And then, I think I really welcome the questions that were asked, because I think it helps us to reflect more deeply on our positions. And I think very important questions were asked. And I'll try and respond to them all adequately. So on the question of violence, I think that we must understand that the means is the end. And so I remember a Black Panther quote, which I paraphrase, is that you don't end oppression with more oppression, and you cannot end racism with more racism. So we cannot end violence with more violence. We need to engender the kind of politics and the world in our struggles and in our resistance that we want to see as we bring in new forms and new forms of living and alternatives. I think in relation to the question of an informal work and sectors of the economy, this is critical, and I think this links to the question of how, when Mazibuko was speaking about how we see and understand where accumulation takes place today, how it takes place, and how oppression and exploitation takes place. And I think it's changed, and this is why I think we need to move beyond the industrialist worker and our surplus value is found out of workers as in the industrial sectors of the economy. And I think this relates very strongly to the question of the unemployed, which is no longer simply the reserve army of labor. I think it's well beyond that, particularly in some African contexts like South Africa and Zimbabwe. And so here we need to really rethink, and this also relates to the question of who the agents of change are. In terms of the question about South American thinkers of the 70s and the 80s, I think we can extend it beyond that to thinkers across times and places. And I think we today, in building an emancipatory politics for today, need to build on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, but not in a way that's uncritical. We need to see what can work for us today and what cannot. And in doing that, building differently and with new imaginations, it doesn't sort of, as I was saying earlier on, feel that we have the answers to everything. And be happy to interrogate and question ourselves, whilst at the same time be happy to say we don't know and we continue to learn. Anyone who says they know everything, don't trust them. In terms of the role of the state and in relation to the Workers' Party, 100% agree. Mazibuko made the same point as well. And I think this is about how we look at municipalities and like remunicipalism as one form of resistance and building new. This is not to say that we reject the nation state in its totality, but it can no longer be the only site of struggle. We have to think about how, through looking at other alternatives and other levels of state, we can decentralize power and sort of hand power back towards people in very democratic and having more democracy and not less. And so this sort of brings organically into the question of the Workers' Party or the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party. Now, I think in relation to this, the kind of politics that the Workers' Party is trying to espouse cannot meet the needs for liberation and emancipation that we need today. It's far too narrow. It doesn't take into consideration the role of the environment or gendered oppression, or the way work has changed and where work is located today, particularly in relation to the unemployed. So I think that whilst we mustn't be rejectionists and reject everything without coming up with alternatives, I think we must also see the limitations of some things, and once again we're seeing something declared from above, which I would echo Mazibuko is not really Marxist or revolutionary at all. Mr. Powell, you asked some very difficult questions. I think the question about labor and the conflict between wages and profits, we're seeing a dramatic shift to profits and the reduction in real wages over time across the globe. And this means that we're still seeing surpluses being pumped out of the direct producers. But I don't think it ends there. But I haven't fully formed my thoughts on this, and so I must admit I'm not clear on that. But I do think it's something that we really need to take into consideration, in trying to figure out where are the pivot points in trying to change society today. And that once again speaks to moving beyond a narrow worker perspective. But your second question I thought was also very interesting, and that is like, how do we respond to building the new today, essentially, in my understanding. And I think this is critical, particularly when people are hungry, when people don't have housing, when people feel completely depressed, demoralized, and disillusioned, and they think it's their fault. And so I think we cannot just resist alone. We've tried it. We've seen the limitations of it. That is not to say we do not resist, but I think this really brings to the center how can we build different societies now while trying to resist, so that people can eat, so that people can feel confident in themselves and not look to something outside of themselves in trying to change society. I think this is so fundamental. I think on the left we disregarded this. We just wanted to have the big politics taking over big moments, and we haven't seen how we need to look at different ways into getting to that moment. And so things like, what's this, small-scale agriculture, and all these kinds of initiatives, we must really be applauded and celebrated as ways of trying to transform society whilst at the same time contesting power.
So I'll start there. I wonder, even though you pose it to Dominic, organization of production is dispersed nature across the globe, and the question about the development of productive forces. Within the current frame, without looking for solutions beyond capitalism, there has to be global labor standards. There have to be more radical projects of a BRICS-like, not exactly the BRICS as we have, countries in the South that seek to reorganize production and accumulation on a global scale to contest the dominant powers. That's within the capitalist frame. If we, and also another dimension is the question of capabilities, whether it's education, whether it's the social age. Those questions will be key in formulating the things you're asking about. But then, taking a step now beyond, but still within the injustices of capitalism, could be other experiments that are perhaps having an anti-systemic logic. For example, the cooperatives in Bologna, in Italy, the cooperatives in Brazil, have posed this question in a very interesting way. How do you extract surplus differently from capitalist enterprises? Can it be done outside of the exploitative mode? And what happens to that surplus after it's extracted? How is it distributed? Is it even correct to conceptualize the surplus? Is it something else? Is it use value? Is it something else? So the alternative that can go beyond within the country is still very nascent. It's still very, and then I think it's not just a theoretical question, it's also an organizing question. So there's a lot of work to do in this regard. But those little experiments cannot succeed any further without addressing the question of governance of the state. So that question at the back. Again, within capitalism, insofar as the state is an elected body, insofar as the state has a public mandate and is in control of public resources, we have to work with the state, we have to contest the state, and where possible, even go as far as transforming elements of the state, whether it's municipalism, whether it's the accountability of ESCOM, or even the electoral system, or even the power that bourgeoisie has over the state. Those can be contested, but that again requires some serious political organization. But at the same time, we cannot end there. It's states under capitalism, and many of these states are actually neoliberal. So there has to be an element in the strategy that is to talk about going against the state, but also the beyond what I was talking about. The state is not going to give us seed banks, seed sovereignty as rural farmers. It goes over to private leaders. So there's a need then to construct alternatives that go beyond what the state can offer. But in my view, it's the technical flexibility and the strategic ability to combine the with, beyond, and against in effective ways. This question about informal sector and so on. You see, I think from an emancipatory perspective, anti-systemic perspective, the question of organizing there is whether we can, in a Luxembourgian sense, construct those activities in the so-called informal market in a way that builds a reserve fund. Luxembourg talks about this in the mass strike. It's not going to be one day of a general strike that defeats capitalism, but can the working class build a reserve fund? So 3 years in the mine, 2 years being unemployed, what do you do that accumulation in the mine? Perhaps you build a home in the former homeland. Perhaps you build a reserve of cattle and other things. But can those actually be organized differently in ways that build the reserve fund for the long-term onslaught on the exploitative systems? I don't think these questions are easily grappled with. There's so you can take it further. People like Federici and others have conceptualized the notion of popular welfare that exists as feminist practice, even within unpaid labor. But how do we take that popular welfare from just being eking out a living, but to a transformative project? To what extent should it combine with the social wage, with the working public sector, but also the broader political strategy? I think for me it's not one to the exclusion of the other. This then links to this debate about underdevelopment, because ultimately all of those things this exist in underdeveloped countries where there's not significant levels of industrialization or investment and so on. The Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party are Marxists of the old type, like the SACP, and they're not going to offer us anything that takes us forward. I mean, when the time is going to be. The last question, there are 2 other questions, sorry. My critique among Africanists and the Percussionist movement was insofar as elements within. But actually, I take the point you're making about the need then for Marxism to grapple with phenomena that, given its historical origins, it could not, even the tools it developed, it needed to grapple with. So, at the same time, there are bridges. For example, the concept of alienation could be very useful to connect the dispossessed worker and the dispossessed being. There are bridges as well. So, for example, part of the debate about land today, most of the debate is thinking about land as a productive unit, whereas actually land is also an identity and being. And so I don't know the problem with those that are well, it's absolutely crucial. I think I've made a point about linking the position of China, though. All it does, it could offer some breathing space for countries of the South if they had a radical project. But there's no radical project. That's the problem.
We'll take another round, but if everyone can just try to keep it to one question.
But who has never operated within a Marxist organizing or political space, and who often feels like these are difficult spaces to engage in because of the polemics, because of feelings of ideological brick walls that exist within Marxism, and sometimes just feelings around that it's not really an open space for youth or Marxists who are grappling with their Marxism to enter. So mine is broadly just a question around consciousness building, very practically thinking about building movements and building strong, collective, broad-based movements, and how in the past we've seen the role of information sharing, so emancipatory education, the role of pamphleting. We've had a rich history of very accessible education material that is in a variety of languages, that breaks down difficult theoretical concepts. And I feel like there's a lacuna at the moment, that a lot of the discussions around Marxism, a lot of the debates are happening within a university setup, that these aren't necessarily happening across the board. And I also worry about whether we're adapting, Marxism and Marxist organizations, particularly in South Africa at the moment, are adapting to the ways that people are consuming media today. Your youth today are engaging in politics. They are debating about things. It's not that people aren't speaking about, questions of labor, questions of land. It's just that the frames of analysis that we've been provided with within the public realm are incredibly limited. And I can't find something that's accessible and cool, that is, that I think is radical. It's not easy to find those kinds of things on social media or even just within a schooling environment, for instance. So mine is a question around consciousness building and education. Where is that? Are there spaces right now that are doing that? And if not, why not?
So my question is somewhat about the party, right? Because we heard the theory, we heard the Marxist theory, forms of organizing in a vague general sense. However, what I noticed was that there was an escaping the legacy of the Marxist-Leninist party in the 20th century. Mazibuko made reference to self-declared Marxist-Leninists. However, across the board, the Marxist-Leninist party in the 20th century was one that did not live to the values of non-sectarianism. People were purged, yourself included, if I remember correctly. And safety gulags. And I think that if we speak about socialism, we sometimes limit ourselves too much to the Marxist, particularly the Marxist-Leninist conception of socialism, and that we ignore other valuable contributions by socialists dating back to Marx's time as well. The debates were happening then. And I think that we can't do the Lenin and call people, and say people have infantile disorders. We have to seriously engage with how we can have true democratic socialism. I feel like you guys have escaped the legacy of the Marxist-Leninist party.
It's also it's a shame that in Africa, in this place, we still have to be followers of Karl Marx after over almost 2 centuries. Seems we don't invent ourselves, we don't innovate. But my problem with Marxism is that it has failed altogether, historically speaking, as you said. Why? Because the greatest weaknesses with Marxism has been to be too economist, to say, okay, history, the laws of history are inevitable. After capitalism, we are going to usher humankind into communism. It's inevitable. Without realizing that capitalism has also the capacity for auto-humanizing, for adapting to the realities of challenges of socialism. And there we see how the welfare state in the West, how capitalism responded with the welfare state. And so the class struggle was pacified. So, and secondly, because of that failure in the conception of history, Marxism lacks morality. Yes, we don't need morality, we don't need moralizing people, because laws of history are inevitable. And now, after taking over, after proletarians taken over, in Russia, in China, all over, we see now comrades fighting against each other. We talked about peerages, talked about the military-industrial complex crushing the workers and the peasants, for example. Why? Because they ignored morality. So are you ready to reform in that way? Find morality for Marxism. If you can, then I would advise you to discard altogether Marxism and to invent a new system. If it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentations. My TK from the University of the Free State. My question basically around religion being the opium of the people. And looking into contemporary times, you find that as poverty has risen, so has the Pentecostal movement, with the prophets, pulling in numbers. Because of the rise in poverty, you find that a lot more people are going to church. Right. So my question then goes to what, from a contemporary Marxist perspective, can we do in order to counter the commercialization of people's suffering that is being done within a religious context?
Dominic is trying to walk with you as to what question to answer. I shall not be tempted to abide by his lobby. The first question at the back, I think your statement in your question contains answers which I agree with. I agree with everything you've said. All I can say is one thing. We do not have a renewed Marxist project in South Africa. We need to build it from below, from practice. It doesn't have to be built in isolation, in a small left group. It can be built in movements, in collaboration, and at times contestation with other forms of thought and political practice. We don't have it. We tried once with the Democratic Left Front, which we folded, and when we formed the Democratic Left Front, there were a few words that were very powerful. How do we unlearn the nonsense that the brother is referring to? And how do we learn anew? So I think that's still the task. And I think it's an open invite. The fortunate thing that we have in South Africa is the mass consciousness about the problems of capitalism and some kind of mass identity with the need for an alternative. Whereas if it was elsewhere, it would be even difficult to talk about the need for the renewed Marxist project. And in my view, it has to be open-ended. It cannot be doctrinaire. It has to, and there's been a lot of work, my brother, to deal with the economic deterministic limits of a particular form of Marxism. I don't have time to go into detail, but Marxism has grappled with that across the world. How do you go beyond that economic determinism? And the unfortunate thing with what happened to the Soviet Union was to take the Marxist word as the final arbiter on all questions. Whereas actually, all Marxist contribution was about was to try and put forward an understanding of the internal logic of capitalism. So that's what Christian politicalism is about. And it needs to be applied in this context. It's not to be just given in particular ways. And if we're to renew Marxism, we have to go back to the question of morality. There are both bad and positive examples with regards to how Marxism has grappled with morality across the world. Dominic, I will leave the last two to you.
Okay. So, to Sarita, once again, as Mazibuko says, agree with you completely. Sometimes I say, Mazibuko, what do we do? What do we do? And he says to me, comrade, don't despair, organize. I think that is critical because particularly in trying to build consciousness, which I think is an ongoing process, we need to do it through building organization and just a quirk is something to the effect of what you can learn in a strike or a demonstration in one day, it's 10 days workshops, So through organizing and building together, I think we develop our consciousness. But on the question of decolonizing education, once again, I think it's important that we are able to popularize education material that is useful in building organization, pamphleteering. Maybe we should become back into our politics. But also, I think that we can take a leaf out of Thomas Sankara's book in the way that he tried to popularize education within his context, but also to the students in the room, right? We often find ourselves in these academic spaces without thinking about how we can go beyond it. Maybe one of the things that we should be doing is going to different communities and sort of trying to teach or discuss economic literacy in a way that can sort of demystify the economics of the world. In relation to the party, I think that I agree with you on the Marxist-Leninist, your critique of the Marxist-Leninist conception of the party, right? It reproduces hierarchies, and you need to toe a line, and it doesn't open up the space for debate, discussion, etc. Otherwise, you get kicked out like my comrade on my left. But this, I think this does not necessarily mean that we reject electoral politics in its entirety. I think that through what we see in Barcelona, Kabul, Podemos, and Syriza, in parts of Europe, etc., we see how electoral politics can be organized differently and being used as a space to bring together collectives of different people, determining how we determine society. Particularly in terms of where we are now, where consciousness is at now. People are, many are not going to the polls, but many are still going to. I think we need to think about how we can incorporate in an emancipatory politics today. Sure, the question about moralism. I think that we cannot define our politics by morals alone. Yes, we need to have an ethics, we need to have a morality, but that is not how we're going to change society. And it's pure, it's too pure, because people are going to, I almost swore. People are not going to always be pure human beings with this morality that comes from I don't know where. And so in the process of building together, I think we determine what kind of person, the new person that we need to be today. And so it's not Marxism that is delinked from a morality, but it's how do we build a morality that's not a top-down morality. In relation to the question of religion, I think that quote about religion being the opium of masses is often taken out of the context, and I think there's a little paper that Marx wrote that sort of gives a more clearer perspective, for me at least, on religion and the role that it plays. And I don't disagree with you, when people are alienated, we look at other forms of power or other forms that gives us a sense of where we belong, right? So I think here, once again, it's not to reject religion or to dismiss it, but in the sense of spirituality and being spiritual beings, how can it be incorporated into the new person that we want to build today? And in moving beyond alienation, perhaps there won't be a religion, but maybe there still will be, but there's room for this pluralisms, and there's room for difference, I think. So,
I forgot something, but I also now am tempted to re-enter the debate on religion, just to say, in that regard, the task is both for those on the left, but also for progressive religious people to undertake. How does liberation theology get born again? In a country the point I forgot was in response to my brother about when I was criticizing Marxism on the truth cause he was criticizing. What I forgot to say these 2 points. Marxism is a method. It's not a doctrine, it's a method. It's a tool of analysis. It's a way to understand the world. And then different people can reach different conclusions using the same methods. So that's crucial to understand. And what the Soviet experience did was to remove the method in the essence of Marxism. And then it changed into a doctrine, into a faith that could not be challenged. It's more a method. And I think if we approach it that way, then it becomes more creative, it becomes more innovative and more responsive to the issues. The question of morality matters, in my view, and the question in that regard, in fact, socialism, not so much Marxism, but the socialist movement across the world, has actually put forward very emancipative elements with regards to morality, and we shouldn't throw that with the bathwater of Stalinist crimes and so on. But at the same time, morality can be conservative. So we should also take that into account. Thank you.